am and have been. It's a real privilege to have Carl Wilkens here with us. I didn't say this before this, but our kids grew up with his kids. So we've known the Carl Wilkens family and his relatives. His brother Keith Wilkens was my doctor in Spokane, and their kids, all of us together, all of our kids together have grown up, and so it's been a wonderful time. He graduated with my wife at Walla Walla, and so I was 1 year before, but so we're all in this journey together, and all of us are seeking to know and understand how God can work in us and grow in us His image, right, in all of our relationships. So we're looking forward to that time with Carl. So let's ask for God's blessing as we get started today. Let's pray. Father in heaven, we pray that you'll bless us now as we consider some really, really important things, the way that you are working in people's lives today, and you want to work in our lives too. And you've done that work, and you're in process with Carl, and we thank you for him sharing with us now. We pray your blessing on him and all of us. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you. Good afternoon. I was peacefully sitting on a bench at Lions Park talking to friends when Jody Washburn walked by and said, "I'm going up there to listen to Carl Wilkens speak. Are you going?" And I looked at my watch and it said 3:27, and I'm like, oh my. So thank you for your patience. And thank you for coming out on such a gorgeous spring day. I think about the potential. We could have done it down at Lions Park, huh? What were we thinking, Jeff? Of course, I'm so tied to my pictures, though, and the illustrations. That would have been a little tough. But I really would like to. I was telling Jeff, I hope it's not a kind of prophetic 15 minutes, but a literal 15 to 20 minutes to just wrap up some things we didn't get to when we were together earlier. And then I really am hoping for some conversation. Come up a little higher, the camera there. Thank you, Ruby. We'll do that. And because, I so appreciated the conversation last evening in the chapel there, and your questions and your perspectives. And this is always something that I'm trying to still wrap my head around and understand. And as you heard in church, wrestling with some of these things, you know, what we know and what we believe in our heart, sometimes we have that conflict that goes on. And so before, though, I was tempted to just come and finish with Maria and Philbert. But before we do, also recognizing that I also lose myself at different times. So the one thing I wish I would have added at Sabbath school time was how Maria and Philbert tried to avoid each other when he got out of prison. And we'll dig into a project, hopefully I'll get there, that the community was doing together, and how that opportunity was such a big one in changing their lives and the way they looked at each other. The story that I mentioned in Sabbath school this morning about our orphanage, that one of the biggest orphanages that we were bringing food and water to. And I know I just dove into this because I'm just assuming that this isn't your first time this weekend. I'm thinking if they came out on a Saturday afternoon, they've probably been with us at least part of the time before. So you know we're talking about the genocide in Rwanda, and where I was working there with Teresa and our kids as the ADRA director, and the decision that Teresa and I made to stay there. And then how Rwanda is putting the pieces back together now. And what I was just going to say, what we touched on in Sabbath school, this little story where we showed up at the orphanage with water, and we were surrounded by these 50 militia guys. And the story ends with me asking these kind of the faded, I have the two pictures next to the secretary there on the far left. No, you're far right. Because they killed the prime minister, and the guy with the beard was the extremist prime minister, and he's the one who will stop the massacre. So where I'm going here is Maria and Filbert had an opportunity to see each other differently in a project they were doing together. This orphanage, after these kids were spared the massacre on that day, and they moved them to the basement of another church a little bit after that, I went back to that orphanage, and I'm not sure I'm going to find that picture. I went back to the orphanage with my coworker Gasikwa to collect the things that were taken from the orphanage. The kids were evacuated in such a hurry that they were told, you can't carry anything. And without getting into too much more detail, the kids didn't know if they were being rescued or if they were being taken to the river and murdered, because that was a typical thing that they would do at that time. They would load people. It was easier to take living people loaded into a truck and then take them down to the river, and sometimes not even kill them, but just throw them in the river to drown. So it was a terrifying moment for the children to be evacuated from there, and what a relief when they found out they were going to the basement of St. Michelle's Church. But they had no cooking pots, no blankets and things. So I went back to collect those things with my coworker Gasikwa, and we came face to face with the leader of the killing squad, Gregoire. And I'm going to hold, some of you have probably heard me share the story of Gregoire already. That was one that we didn't get to actually this morning, but I'm going to pull up. Okay, so there's the orphanage I was going to tell you about. And actually, I'll hold the picture there for a minute. Because as Gasikwa and I came in the parking lot to collect the belongings, snipers started to shoot at us in the front of the building. So we went around to the back. And as we came around to the back, I came face to face with the leader of the killing squad. And I'm sure he's going to kill me and Gasikwa. They had tried twice to do a massacre at this orphanage, and both times had been thwarted. And now I'm like, what's to stop them? But I had a paper authorizing me to be there from the colonel who was in charge of the city. I pull out that paper. You know, one of the big things we try to understand with this is why people did it. And then you begin to unpack obedience to authority. And some of you have taken deeper dives, and you've looked at the Milgram experiment, and you've looked at how people obey authority and they pass on responsibility to somebody else who ordered me to do it. But back to this man here, I come face to face with him. I pull out that document in my pocket. He reads it. Again, it's ordering me, giving me authority to collect the orphans' belongings. He reads it and he says, yeah, of course, the orphans need their goods. And he orders this gang who just, 2 days before was ready to where's their picture right here? These guys, they were ready to kill everybody in that orphanage, and he orders them to help me load my truck. And so I'm working with them for over an hour, loading the truck. And this is what came to me. I'm sorry, it kind of took me a long time to get here. But they got me they actually helped me find, my pickup was too small. They helped me find a bigger truck in the neighborhood that I rented. It had low sides. And we're thinking, how can we get more stuff in this truck with low sides? The cafeteria tables. So I'm on one end of a cafeteria table, one of these guys with a machine gun over his shoulders on the other end. And we're carrying this out and then standing it on end, lining them up on the sides of the truck. So now we have high sides on our truck, and it's just heaping with, I had told them when you're inside, just find a blanket, put clothing, toys, photographs, whatever you can, and tie that bank and, bring it outside. And soon, even this big truck was just heaped mounds of these blankets full of the orphans' belongings and the cooking pots and other things we needed. But as I was writing that up, how am I going to communicate that? And I recognized in the writing that when we engage our mind and our muscles in acts of service, it changes the way we think about ourselves and about the other. By the end of the afternoon, I'm clapping these guys on the back. Thanks, that was really, you're a really strong guy. That was really, you guys, I don't know how to thank you, really appreciate all this. as if they're not killers in the middle of a genocide. And you see, Maria and Filbert, they too got an opportunity to kind of reinvent themselves, to see themselves as more than just one thing, as more than a killer. Their neighborhood was building homes for one another in the community. And Maria and Filbert tried to avoid each other. They didn't want to see each other. She didn't want to talk to him. But they just couldn't avoid each other. And they would spend the mornings working, making these adobe bricks, down there in the pit, stomping in the mud and stuff. And then they spent the afternoon talking as a community, processing and healing. But I'm going to back up even before this. How is, and we'll come to the problem that where we kind of left off at church. You'll remember we've got more than 100,000 people accused of killing their neighbor. How are we going to do any kind of justice system for them? In fact, why would you even try? The Holocaust, the genocide in Cambodia, in Bosnia, the former Yugoslavia, they never tried to hold the ordinary people accountable. It was just too overwhelming. Nobody thought that was even possible. They would go after the leaders, maybe the second level down. But Rwanda recognized that if we're going to have sustainable peace here, our country will be better with everybody in it. I actually didn't show you this morning what I shared with the group last night, but then I didn't tell the story to the group last night. You remember last night, these are the architects of the genocide. This is the small group of men and women who planned it. Maybe 15 years later, I'm in Rwanda, and I'm talking to the president's chief of staff, and I'll show her to you in a moment. And I said, Ines, I heard that the government was going after the children of the planners of the genocide. And then I always pause there because I don't want to tell you what the rest of the story was. I want you to imagine it. I mean, my imagination was, we're watching you. We know who your parents are. We're going to put you on some sort of watch list or something. That's my thinking. But the story that I had heard was that the government went after their children to tell them, you don't have to be defined by your parents. And I said to Ines was in her 30s, brilliant lady as you might imagine. She's the president's chief of staff. And I said to her, a mother of two children, she was right here a minute ago. You probably wonder how I find anything as I'm scrolling through here, don't you? Maybe you're not. You're like, I just wish that guy was better organized. Yeah, I'm going to find her because the second time through I can't miss her. And Ines says to me, well, that's not exactly true, she says. In reality, come on, I just saw you a minute ago, Ines. I usually do give up after the second time through. But this time I'm not. No, okay, I will. Ines says, that's not exactly true. She says, what really happened is the children of the planners, I'm going to be so happy when I find her. The children of the planners of the genocide came to us. This was that kid from Chicago I told you about, giving Maria a hug after hearing her story. You imagine those kids and how their lives were changed forever from this trip to Rwanda. But Ines, okay, I really will. I'll just stop with that picture. Ines says, no, that's not exactly true. They came to us. And I'm like, what? Yeah, they came to the president's office to say, we do not want to be defined by what our parents did. And I'm like, that's an even better story. What kind of environment will it take? What kind of environment do you have to create that the children of the planners of the genocide come to the president's office in the country and say, let's all be on the same page here. We're not our parents. We are our own people. She went on to tell me about some who were working in, positions of real responsibility. And anytime something would go wrong, who's the first one to belong? Well, we know who your mother was. We know what you did in the genocide. Man, one of these One of the stories, I actually met the mother in prison who had a terrible reputation for the brutality that she let out during the genocide, particularly against men, and how this one daughter, though, kept coming to prison and visiting her mom every week because she was still her mom. The other daughters tried to distance themselves. I mean, imagine trying to get a date and the guy knows who your mother was and what she did during the genocide. There's so many perspectives to try to understand and wrap our minds around. But Maria and Filbert were given this opportunity, building homes, to see each other as more than the killer of her husband and sons. So I'm going to settle down here now. You know, I'm just trying to casually find Enos as I'm coming back through here. There's just a light in her eyes, and I just, you know, so many people, the journalist will write up stories about, there she is. The journalist will write up stories about Rwanda and do I need to do something different? Oh, thank you, Jeff. Thank you. I'll try to just stay here. They'll write up stories about Rwanda and the Kagame regime. They love to use that word regime with its baggage and things like that. And they have no idea all of the people behind the scenes and in front of the scenes, the governors of the different districts, the head of the Supreme Court for years, I'm not sure if she still is, was a woman. And the role of women, we'll get into that in just a little more. And okay, and I'm remembering, I said we're going to do 15, 20 minutes, and then we're going to do questions. So let me finish this part off here. We've got more than 120,000 people accused of genocide. And what's the government going to do? So this is my latest version, trying to compare what Rwanda did with what we know around the world as a regular justice system. And I know it's a super oversimplified, so please be patient with me. But they recognize, just for practical reasons, we can't do the regular, have defense lawyers, prosecution lawyers, we can't do all of that. And so they reached back into their past, and am I in the right place in my folders? And yeah, I'll get to it. And they went back to a practice that they'd known for hundreds of years of, and some of you are familiar with the term, restorative justice. And it's always rooted in indigenous communities. And so they come to this one. How are we going to, first we got to make sure that it's safe. Everybody's safe, both physically and emotionally. We got to do our best to have a safe foundation. Because if we try to unpack the harm and it's not safe, we can do more harm. And then once we really understand the harm, we've got to have all the voices to understand the harm. We've got to have all the voices to make a repair plan that might work to repair that harm. How do you repair genocide? How do you repair the mass slaughter of families and things like that? And Rwanda said, we're gonna repair it in a similar way that it happened, from the grassroots up, one person at a time. So Rwanda is going to set up, thanks, Chad. I see I came late, and so I didn't give these people a chance to tell me where to stand and what to do, and so thank you, Chad. So they set up community courts. Remember I told you how tiny this country is, right? Top little corner of Washington State. More than 12,000 community courts. So if you put pins where every single one was, it would be like a solid block of pins, the country there. And these community courts are made up of the community. People in the community vote for the judges. Lawyers, judges, sorry, you're not allowed to be part of this process. This is a community process. This is a grassroots process. And the community will pick, they'll end up, after several versions, they'll end up with 9 judges. And they have this law already on their books in their constitution that 1/3 of every decision-making group has to be women, minimum. So the parliament in Rwanda, 1/3 of the parliament seats are only for women to, run in elections. The other 2/3, men and women, can compete. Today, more than 2/3 of the parliament in Rwanda is women. I want you to think about rebuilding trust. I want you to think about rebuilding a sense of identity, a shared identity, and then think about the role that women can, the powerful role that women can play in rebuilding trust and a shared sense of identity. There were wild stories going around a while back that it's illegal to use the word Hutu or Tutsi in Rwanda. And every time I went there and would talk to people, they're like, no, that's not illegal. It's just how you talk about them. How do you talk about the other? So I could really go down a rabbit hole right now in terms of social media and how we talk about the other. And we think we're okay because we're talking to people who think like us. So we can say whatever we want. And when you look at, you understand a little more why I'm so passionate about neuroscience and how every time I say a sentence, I'm strengthening a pathway in my brain. So even using the word killer instead of somebody who killed is a very different pathway in my brain than the label killer. And so I'm not going to go down that. I've just planted the seed, and you can go down that rabbit hole if you want. Because really, me examining how you talk on social media is pretty meaningless. It's only when I'm willing to examine how I talk on social. It's this self-examination that I think can, at least for me, bring about change. Otherwise, my defenses go up and, well, I didn't mean that. And can't you take a joke? And why are you so, thin-skinned? And no. I think the real evaluation happens when I'm self-evaluating. So these courts, the man in the middle there with a pink uniform, it's probably on a soccer field, and usually Thursday afternoon, schools closed, shops closed, and they've come out to do this version of gacaca. Now before, gacaca was really just basically the respected male elders in the community called together to problem solve. Women were excluded from it. Not anymore. Not when they brought it to this context. How Rwanda is going to judge the people who committed genocide. So if you're in prison, like Filbert, you could be given the option. We don't know when you're going to get a regular trial. Maybe you've been here 5 years already. We still don't know. I mean, technically it's not an exaggeration. It could take 100 years. So if you want to go through gacaca, you could get your time cut in half. You could find a pathway out of prison back home. I remember the first time I asked students back in North Carolina, what good is a confession from somebody if they're not sorry? And before that, I would say, not very good at all. What value is that? But remember Maria. Maria is interested to know where her husband and sons are buried. You don't have to be sorry to help her know that. And I've often thought, too, about you're sitting in prison, and like Filbert, you're trying to decide, am I going to confess or not? People are threatening to kill me. I want to get home. I want to go to my family. I want out of here. And if things go well at gacaca, I'll go into the repair program, which is community service. I'll be living in the community. My camp will not be a prison camp because there will be no fence, no walls. The guards won't even have guns. I tried not to put too many words here, but I tried to put just keywords like collaborative. Collaborative. We'll always have punitive because there'll be people who will not want to take part in a restorative plan. But if you're ready to collaborate, you could end up in these camps, building roads, building terraces, making bricks, doing all kinds of projects. Again, I pick my words carefully, to reinvent yourself and to reinsert into the community again, to reintegrate with it. How are we going to put somebody safely back in the community who has committed genocide? So they would go through these times of confession, and then not just confession, but asking questions. One of my friends, she says, my mom in gacaca, she says, my mom wanted to know, she had sent my little brothers to live with her sister. At the time, my friend was saying, we were living in Burundi, and we were having trouble getting the kids in school, and we wanted to send them to my sister out by the Lake Kivu, the town of Kibuye, where they could go to school. So they were with my auntie when the genocide happened, and they were all killed. My mom just wanted to know who gave away the hiding place for my little brothers. And so at one of these gachachas, after the confession, and it involved the murder of her sister's family, Mom, who was a social worker at the time, she would go all around, and you think about, I mean, there's so much to unpack. Some of you who are involved with the field of social work, you like right away, your brains are buzzing with what's our work after a genocide? What's going to be the trauma when somebody's released from prison and they're back home? What's it going to be like in the neighborhood? What's the trauma for the killer? Does the killer have nightmares? I mean, all of this. So her mom's a social worker, really in tune with the social needs and the rebuilding of the social fabric. And she had a guy who would drive her around in the government pickup truck to the different neighborhoods where she'd be working. They'd work together for a couple of years. Thursday afternoon, office closed, go to the soccer field. Her mom stands up and says, I want to know who gave away the hiding place of my sons. And the prisoner who's confessing, paused. And then he looks at her. And he looks at the guy sitting next to her, who's been her driver for 2 years. Ask him. And she looks over. And it's like a million things start to flash in her mind. This guy, he's always been so nice. In fact, on weekends, he's even told me, I have access to the truck if you ever need the pickup for anything and stuff like that. And she finds out that he's the one. She's been sitting that close to him for 2 years, who gave away the hiding place of her sons. Did he try over those 2 years to tell her, to confess? Did he have the courage? Did he have the setting and environment where that could be possible? He ended up in jail that night. These trials were very dynamic experiences in the community. Sometimes even a judge would be pointed at and accused. And so this process, the experts in the world said, this is going to fail big time. In fact, you're going to start another genocide in your country. You try to open up all of these wounds with ordinary people, they can't do it. And all of a sudden you hear an echo of colonialism that would say to local people, you can't do it. We're the answer. And obedience to authority would be there. And all of those other components. Rwanda is showing that yes, our local people are able to. This was an incredibly empowering event for the community because people were learning the truth. They were learning to talk together again. Sometimes they'll break down. You can watch on YouTube if you just search Gacaca, Rwanda, and you'll learn different things and you'll see some actual footage of these courts. And sometimes it would be shut down because somebody's going to start wailing in the back and they're just grief just racking their bodies and you have to shut it down. The wisdom that was needed by the Gacaca judges to know when to keep going and when not. These were really they were everything you could imagine on the charts. And some of these decided that, nope, this person's not safe. We're going to send them back to the repair plan in prison. Others would send them, nope, to the repair plan, the community service program that was out there. On the weekend, if they wanted, they could go to a local church. This picture is actually some high school students I'm with, and we're with about 40 men who have confessed to their role in genocide. Now, one of the men said, I'd never killed anybody, but I had to go with the group or I was afraid they would kill my family. So I would lobby, I would argue, let's not kill this family, let's just steal their property. And he says, I can introduce you to a man today and his family who are alive because I argued with them, with the guys in my gang, not to kill them. And me and this man were friends till today. Everybody's got a different story, a different experience in this. What was really interesting too about this are these kids, they're alumni from a program that's called the School of Ethics and Global Leadership. One semester of their junior year in high school, they go to this semester school in Washington, D.C., and so these are all kids who had been through that program. And now they've come to Rwanda because they studied Rwanda when they were at the School of Ethics and Global Leadership. And now they're visiting Rwanda in person. Really brilliant young people. And they asked probably 2 hours of questions of these men. I don't know what you would ask them. I mean, typically the thing would be, why'd you do it, right? But then they go much deeper than that. But at the end, I said to the men there, I said, do you have any questions for the students? And one of the men in his blue uniform in the little plastic chair there raised his hand and he said, you students have been here in Rwanda studying about the genocide, and somebody mentioned the Holocaust. You've studied the Holocaust. What difference does it make? Really good question. And I turned to look at the students who were sitting behind me, and this young lady courageously came forward. Just stop for a minute. She steps up to speak to 40 men who have been involved in genocide, in this murder of more than 1 million people. What courage. And she demonstrates such courage by the first part of her response. I'm still trying to figure that out, she says to him. But one thing I do know is when I go back to America, I'm going to be so much more intentional about building relationships with people I see as different from me. And I remember just looking at her and going, home run. That was just perfect. Thank you very much. So these learning experiences that we get to go on, most of these camps are finished by now in Rwanda. But I wanted to, and we'll wrap it up here. And if you have questions and comments, I want you to think about 2 other things, though, about these community courses. The first one I alluded to already. 40% of the judges were women. So before this, gacaca was just used often for family disputes, little small community disputes. One of my friends who's a professor at a university back in New York, he's Rwandan. He left Rwanda just before the genocide on a Fulbright scholarship. Bright guy. And he says, when I first heard that they're going to use gacaca to handle the people who did genocide, he lost his grandpa, his parents, he lost so many people. He was out himself safe with his Fulbright scholarship. Many of his family killed. I'm like, how are you going to use gacaca? You know, when my aunt and uncle were having marriage problems, we did gacaca to try to get that worked out. But this is genocide. And it's not been perfect, okay? There's people who have abused gacaca. Restorative practices does open up possibilities. If restorative practices was easy, we'd all be doing it. We'd have who knows what percentage of a prison population right now in America. But it's not easy. But what I love about this is I was listening to Phil Clark as a researcher who spent 9 years researching and writing about gacaca in Rwanda. And Phil was saying that the women now who were excluded from gacaca in the traditional past for 10 years, every Thursday they're walking to the soccer field with that sash around their shoulder that says person of integrity. And in the market, they don't need to wear the sash. People know this is a gacaca judge. The role of women and understanding equality and the contributions that women can make and the society we should have, I think was hugely impacted in a positive way by gacaca. The other thing that I would one other point about this is I didn't realize until recently that the innocent could come to gacaca. I'd had students ask me, what about your innocent? What happens? I'm like, I don't know, guys. I think you have to go to regular court. Found out I was wrong. You could go to gacaca. You might confess one thing. I don't even know if you had to confess anything, but you got your day before the community. You would tell your story. Other community members would stand up. Some would say, what are you talking about? You went to the forest to chop wood. You were chopping humans in that forest. So these gacaca times, but 14% of them were acquitted. Not by an expensive lawyer or by some legal loophole, but by their peers, by their neighbors. So when they walked through, remember when I said this morning, is there a time when you can ever walk and look somebody in the eye? You pass through gacaca and your community says you are not guilty. That's the beginning of rebuilding those relationships. Yeah, I've got more stories we could dig into. Okay, this will be a good point, and then I'm hoping you'll have some questions or comments. There's a lot of information that, I'm trying to wrap my own head around, much less present it in a way that I hope makes sense. And so I didn't have this piece in the first part. But breaking the cycle of violence is really our goal. Healing is our goal, very much, but they're hand in hand, the healing and breaking the cycle of violence. So, a young lady says to me last spring, I think it was a year ago in high school, she says, let me get this straight. People who did genocide are given community service? That's like a smack on the wrist. And I'm like, I hear you so clearly. I really hear you. And that's when I said, I'm going to change my drawing a little bit. Or at least I'm going to add on another one, an illustration. The way we grow up and the way we think is what I started to talk about this morning. It's very transactional. You do the crime, you pay the time. You guys know what the consequences are. You did this, you're getting that. Our little 2-year-old grandson, every once in a while, he just kind of blitzes his little brother for no apparent reason. And he knows he's getting a timeout. So Friday morning, no apparent reason, knocked him over. And then he walks right to the timeout chair. His mom didn't even send him. And me and his mom are like, trying so hard not to laugh. And he knows the deal. He knows the action. He knows the transaction. And that's how we think. And it works in so many ways. Except when it doesn't. Which is breaking the cycle of violence. So I said to this young lady, can we look at this other form with a different lens? If I try to wear my transactional glasses over this restorative practices, it's going to be like a slap on the wrist. It's going to be like a joke. And sometimes it has been practiced in very irresponsible ways in schools and in other places. That's really where my hope is in America. Wait a minute. Really? My hope in America for transactional practices to get a foothold and begin to change the way we think and feel and act is in education. I've said that without a pause before, until as it came out of my mouth here now, and I'm standing in a church. Why in the world have I been so comfortable just believing that transactional thinking, restorative processes, our hope is not our justice system in America. It's too far along and it's too big of an industrialized monster to see at least any kind of conversion in my lifetime. But I think that schools have a chance. And now this afternoon I'm wondering, what about churches? I should have thought of it before, because when I was coming up with this drawing here and comparing the punitive with the restorative, and I contacted a leading genocide scholar in the world. He's Greg Stanton is quoted all the time by genocide scholars. He's the one who came up with the 7 and then 10, 8 and then 10 stages of genocide. And I said, Greg, I sent him a little couple pictures, and I said, Greg, I'm working on this process. And I wanted you to have a look at it. He's just such a nice and approachable guy. He's back, retired now from back in D.C. at George Mason University. And Greg looked it over and he said, Carl, this is the gospel. And I'm like, okay, I knew Greg, and I knew Greg was a practicing Christian. And I knew Greg wasn't shy about it. But I said, you're right, Greg. And then now I say to myself, well, Carl, what do you think was leading you to connect the dots all along? as you're looking at Rwanda's story, as you're looking at what's happening in the schools and in the countries and places we are. And so I'm thinking to myself, you have something taken from you. I mean, okay, say it's just your house or your car or some physical property. That's one thing. But you have something taken from you that's family. How do you ever heal? How do you ever restore? How do you move forward? And I think Maria largely was doing it for her daughter, and so many others like that. Young guys, good friends of mine, their dads worked for me, both of them actually, their dads worked for me when I was in Rwanda. And these guys, I'm meeting them in their early 20s, late 20s. They've survived the genocide as teenagers. And they're like, oh, Carl, we're kind of ruined for life, but our kids, we have hope for our kids. And I'm like, no, you guys are not ruined for life. But often it's for our kids that will make this decision. I'm going to let go of my transactional right for justice in choice in favor of a restorative, a transformative approach. And then when I look at it, I'm looking at it with a different, I'm not looking for a pound of flesh. A pound of flesh will not satisfy. That's why the justice system so often leaves us feeling empty and unfulfilled and unhealed. And in many ways, the justice system isn't for the individual. The justice system is for the society. And that's why I'm so excited as I look at Rwanda's model for the individual. And to bring that individual accountability, because while we may ask people, why did you do it? The question that's often at the heart of survivors is, will you do it again? And so, yeah, that's where I'm going to pause. I think I am. Okay, there's the grandkids. That's where I'm going to pause. It's been so fun with them because since I started learning about, and I just barely know enough about the brain to be dangerous, but I've been learning about, how you can form pathways, you can fire and rewire your brain. I watch these guys all the time with that lens, and I know they're building neural pathways. What is it? Some of you could probably tell me the figure. Isn't it something like 75% of their calories are burned in neural activity in these early developmental years? Us adults, okay, it may be less percentages with some than others, but us adults, we're burning, I don't know, is it 15% of the calories for neural activity? I'm sure I'm off, but I think I'm in the ballpark. And I think about it with these guys, is he doing something? I want to attach an adult way of thinking to his action. He hasn't connected those pathways yet. He's still trying to figure it all out. So I'm thinking, when he blitzes his little brother, don't just assume he's got this negative streak in him. He's still trying to put it all together and figure out what life's about. So, this is what I do, and did I burn all our time? Well, a lot of it. Didn't burn it. I got to work on how I talk to myself too. That could be another conversation we could have, self-compassion, and that would be fun to have. Oh my goodness, I'm just thinking to myself, God is so patient with me. What did you just say, Carl? Burned all the time? What do you think we've been doing here? I hope we've been growing closer to the character of God, to understanding the ways of God. And God is love, and it's that love that defines and I don't like to use the word demands, compels, moves us to repair. That kind of love. So my two options when I'm talking with students, and I'll give you the same. Option A, I just ask anybody that would like to make a comment or has a question to raise your hand. And if nobody has a question or raises their hand, we go to plan B. You talk to the person next to you. You come up with a question, and we go back to plan A. So anybody want to spare us plan B? Or plan B might be the best part, talking to the person next to you. I don't know. Ruby's asking about a mutual friend who ended up bringing the young man who killed her. Do you know what year she got him out of prison? No, but it would have been after Gachacha started. And she was doing ministry in prison, kind of taking the place her husband had done, a pastor, and was killed. And some of you may have heard Ruby and John share that story. And she goes to bat and gets this man out of prison who killed her son. And the stipulation that the prison authorities give, as I understand the story, is he needs to stay with you initially. And he'll stay in her home for 9 months, and that's another story. I'll tell you the short part of that story that you'll appreciate, hopefully in a short time, is her neighbors told her she was crazy when she did it. He's going to kill you one night in your sleep. And years later, when her neighbors start to rebuild relationships, she would say to them, I thought you said I was crazy. And she says they would respond, we all are. And yeah, it is crazy. I mean, how many times do people listen to Jesus and say, that is crazy? Crazy beautiful. I'm sensing a plan B. I almost see a hand raised. I was the auctioneer at Milo Volunteer Fire Department, so I can sell you an apple pie real quick. Please. Microphone's coming through there. Thanks, Jeff. Okay, and then we'll come to you next. Please.
What kind of sentences, quote unquote, were handed out in the transformative model?
So is the sentence, she's asking what kind of sentences, is the sentence about the crime, or is the sentence about healing and being safe to come back to the community, or both? And I would say definitely both was taken into consideration. Some of the people who got to that point of the courts there had already spent 7, 8 years in prison. And they would say, you've spent your time, and you would go home from the court, not go to the service camp. Others would go to the service camp for 2, 3, 5 years. I don't know the full span, but that's the rough idea. But that idea of this is the time in the camps is not only related to your crime. The time in the camps is also, and who knows better but the community? Many of these judges, they could have been like the 4th grade teacher for that prisoner. Or maybe the 4th grade teacher is sitting in the audience and asking very penetrating questions that the judges are listening to, which you know will shape their thinking when they confer together and make a decision. Is this person safe to go to the repair camp or to the repair program in prison? Thanks for that question. Jeff over here is another comment.
Carl, you must have joys and regrets through all of it. You've been working the process through, but are there joys that stood out? Are there regrets that stood out?
Joys or regrets that what? That stand out?
Are there joys? Are there things that you look back and say, or now you say, I'm joyful now? Are there must be some things that are highlights that you really look forward, or I mean, that you look back and say, that was a joy.
Yeah.
And you must have other things that you look back and say, I regret.
I definitely regret not having met Maria and Filbert earlier and being brought face to face with my anger earlier. One of the things when I one of my excuses, to brag and put the kids on the screen is thinking, how much did my anger impact their mother, as she was 7 at the time of the genocide, and kind of unrecognized anger. I think that would be a regret that I didn't, have that earlier. And yet I still wrestle with this statement that says God has you exactly where he wants you, when you want. And I'm like, well, man, I'd like to have been here a long time ago. Come on, don't tell me, God, you didn't want me here a long time ago. And I still haven't figured all of that out, but I'm wrestling with it. I think it's a valuable conversation. During the genocide itself, I had a regret at the end. A neighbor came looking for shelter in my house, and I had pretty strong suspicions that he had been involved in the killing, and I didn't let him in my house. I felt like letting him in my house would compromise the safety of the other people in the house. And as soon as I say that out loud, I think about the American Embassy and their decision not to let Rwandans in the convoy because it would compromise the safety of the people in the convoy. That was their reasoning and rationale. And I'm like, okay, that's not an exact comparison, but there are some things to think about in that one. And I didn't talk about that regret for years. Didn't tell my wife, didn't tell anybody for years until finally meeting with a counselor one day, built enough of a relationship and had healed enough myself to get to the point where I could talk to somebody about it, because that man got killed. And I was certain that he got killed because I didn't let him in my house that day. And I had told him, I know the Rwandan Patriotic Front soldiers. I've met with their leadership before the genocide. All the rumors they've been talking about, and the horrible stories they're telling. You obey what they tell you and you'll be fine. But I can't let you in my house. And as I was talking to the counselor that day, and finally the first person telling him about that regret, he said, so when did the man die? And I'm like, oh, I don't really know. So do you know if he died that day? No. How were people dying? Many of them fled to the Congo and they were dying from cholera. Hundreds of thousands of people died from cholera. Like 200,000 people died from cholera. So he could have died there? Yeah. But I'm not going to let myself off the hook. I still think, what if he did die that day and I didn't let him in? Because we're hard to let ourselves off the hook often. And the counselor, really wisely said, okay, so you don't know it. I mean, every time, when we moved back for a year and a half, and I knew where he had lived, and I found out when we moved back that he'd been killed. And that's when I just made this automatic assumption he was killed because I didn't let him in my house. And then every time I'd look at the family and I'd see, this is a single mom raising her kids, struggling, and I'd try to put it out of my mind, and that. And he says, so let's say he did die that day, and maybe wouldn't have died if he'd gone in your house. Would you, if you had to do it over again, would you let him in? And with some years of experience and being able to think more clearly than I surely was thinking that day, down in my downstairs brain probably that day as he's trying to come in and our whole neighborhood is being taken over by the RPF. The genocide is actually ending, but there's wild chaos and gunfire and everything. I said, no, I don't think I would if I did it again. I think what I would do is I would offer to stand with him by the gate, just kind of like our decision to stay with the people in our house and be present. That this power, I would offer my presence to him until the soldiers tell us what you should do. I'll stand here with you. And then if he was guilty of being involved with a lot of murdering and things like that, he might have said thanks, but no thanks, and he'd have been gone. But I felt like I would have offered something of myself. And so I don't know if I would do that again, but to learn from those experiences of regret and stuff, and to have somebody like I had in that counselor who could objectively look and see the faults in my thinking, and then also be able to, help me identify a pathway forward that to me would be the kind of person I want to be. It's really important. I could probably go on longer. I mean, it was one of the there's a book. This is a great time to let you know. There's a book, Celine Uwineza. And the book is called Untamed, and Untamed, Celine, That should be enough. Selena Uineza just popped up there. So let me go to images. That'll give you a better one. So whoops, clicked over there. So you can see right here. This is a wonderful book. I can't recommend it more. I mean, I couldn't. Yeah, I definitely recommend it over our book. Why am I talking to myself like that again? But she's probably 9 or 10 at the time of the genocide, and you'll learn a very heart-wrenching story of her survival. But then how does she survive afterwards? That's the big question for so many of us. And she so candidly, honestly, vulnerably tells her story of survival through high school, through early marriage life. An employer who was so understanding as she was wrestling with this and what the role was. It's just a very powerful book and a very informative book for me and just really helpful. And the reason she just came to mind is because her father-in-law worked with me during the genocide, before the genocide. He was in hiding during the genocide, and we were helping him as he was hiding. And then when the genocide ended, I went and found him, and we went looking for his wife and children, and we found them alive. And Celine's husband was this quiet teenage boy that I remember standing on the side. Celine's mother-in-law nearly cracked my ribs in this hug of bringing, her husband and the family reunion, and that's the hug to me of the prodigal father. This wild, reckless love of God. And so there are incredible stories of that, as well as the pain that still, every time I hear a survivor share their story, I think to myself, how can we as humans do this? And am I doing justice to the story because I don't talk much about all the trauma, and that may be my way of surviving? I mean, the graphic part of it I don't talk much about. So, yeah, those are a few thoughts to your question. Thanks.
A quick comment and a question. So, as adults, we spend about 20% of the calories thinking or using our brain. As kids, sometimes we go north of 40%, so there is an opportunity there for weight loss in people who want to think more, or things like kids maybe. But my question is, on a more serious note, is during that process of repair or restoration that you mentioned, through those courts and individuals that you've seen, do you get the sense that people who had a more profound understanding of the gospel, of the love and character of God, had a more easier path to recovery? Or did you see that at work in some more distinct way, is what I'm looking for.
I really appreciate your question. It makes sense. It would make sense. And I honestly don't have an answer. On the lion's share of my trips back to Rwanda, I'm with a teacher group, and we're visiting with survivors, we're visiting with educators. We're not visiting with Adventists or specifically Christian groups that are there. Some of the people in the groups obviously are Adventists and Christians and stuff. So I would love to know the answer to that question too. And I think that's probably what was driving a text I sent to a friend just this last week, saying if I really believed that we are all made in the unerasable image of God, why is it so hard for me to accept Filbert is changed? Filbert has been, in Maria's eyes, he's beautiful. And I think I'm getting there, but I'm kind of frustrated with how slow that process is. I can tell you that during the genocide, no denomination, ours, as I said last night, the second largest denomination in the country, far smaller, but behind the Catholic Church and then the Adventist and all the other denominations, nobody seemed to distinguish themselves as an organization for standing up against genocide. In the healing process, the name you hear again and again in the restorative healing process is Prison Fellowship International. And that's one that is operating in prisons and really operating strong in this restorative journey in Rwanda. That's the name I hear when I'm traveling around and talking to people. This would be a good time too. One of those Chicago kids that was in the group I was with in the summer of 2019, he said to a lady, and we're in a room of men and women, some of them perpetrators and some of them survivors. And that's kind of where I grabbed this picture. That was the room that we were in, and it was full of men and women. I just had this picture of the women in their beautiful dresses there and the expressions on their face. And this student said to these people, this group, "What about God?" Because the students studied and evidently knew Christianity. 80% of people are in the church most weekends. And one of the ladies answered him, and she said, "Initially we thought God forgot us. And things got worse, and we thought God doesn't like us. And they got even worse, and we decided we don't like God." And she just kind of ended there. And to the student's credit, he said, "But what about today?" And she kind of goes, "We got really lonely, and we decided to try God again." And so I know within the churches, these are the same ladies who said to me, or to a question, I don't remember who and who asked the question and stuff like this, but they said, and I went back and I wrote it down because I'm like, this just really astounds me. They said it's our pain that drives us deeper into love. Now look at that with me for the first time with the lens of God is repair. Because when I first saw that, I first heard that, I'm like, whoa. Because pain often drives us to despair or to anger and bitterness. But rarely have I heard it said, okay, I have heard a friend who went through cancer and how that pain brought them closer to God, and that would be closer to love. But driving us, because I took this drives us deeper into love of others. And that's what was really messing with my head as I looked at that. And then I thought about you're drowning and somebody throws you, and the only life preserver that can keep you from drowning is love. And you recognize this really is the greatest power of the universe. But you've given me some questions to ask my Rwandan friends. Thanks. Pastor Jeff, we're not going to go to plan B as much as I would love to, kind of, because I'm not in a hurry myself personally, but I want to respect our time here, and please.
Well, brother, I really feel and sense the burden that's been placed on you all these years, and it's hard to reconcile the evil that the devil has perpetrated on this perfect world that God made. And when I hear the word transformative, speaking for myself, I'm an old biker. Got my first Harley when I was 19 in California in the 70s.
Wait, sorry, repeat that again?
I'm an old biker.
When you hear the word transformative, yeah.
Yes. It makes me think back in California in the mid-70s when I got my first Harley. I was 19.
Your first what?
Harley.
Okay.
I'm an old biker.
Yeah, okay.
And I'm going back to transformative. I rode with a bunch of Vietnam vets that came back from Vietnam, and I'm telling you, these guys suffered. And they came back, and everybody was hating on them and calling them baby killers. And it was a bloody little war. And these guys had a lot of anger and very self-destructive. And I fell into that world and learned how to hate myself. But I want to get back to transformative. Jesus, he's transformative.
Yeah.
I mean, we had the Civil War. If you go back into the 1920s and they had just a handful of these old veterans, they were hugging each other at Gettysburg when they had killed each other by the tens of thousands before. Societies can reconcile, but true transformation, it's through Jesus. And again, who of us is better than Jesus? Yet he came here and he suffered greatly. And the disciples fled. And, he reconciled with Peter. Do you love me?
Yeah.
And what's helped me the best over the years, because I have a lot of regrets and a lot of hate for things that were done to me. I give it to Jesus. Just like Uriah and David, they're going to meet in heaven. Isn't that going to be an interesting conversation? But God will wipe away all tears. He can reconcile this. But we live in a world where God is giving the universe a chance to see what the devil is all about. And innocence is going to be trampled on for no fault of their own. And God is pained every day to look out on his creation and see this suffering. It cannot be reconciled until it's over. And let's just face it, I'm looking at the stained glass of the second coming. And the time of trouble is coming, such as never was. And it's our belief in Jesus, our faith in him, and our anointing the Holy Spirit that we hold fast to that. And that his character is reflected through us. That's our only salvation. And I'll just end by saying this. We have a penitentiary here. They haven't put somebody to death in a long time. But 30 years ago, there was a man that had been in prison for a long time for a very brutal murder. And he finally got out. And he found his victim. And he raped and killed her and her neighbor that happened to be visiting her at the time. And they caught him and they hung him. They served him his last meal. But it didn't save him. And the only true salvation is through Jesus. And so my prayer is that we are in a time where up in Canada they're putting pastors in jail for standing up for God and the Bible. And that we don't judge people, but we have the courage and strength through the Holy Spirit to proclaim Jesus and his second coming. People don't want to hear it. But that is the only true transformation that we all need to make it to heaven. And I bless your ministry. There does need to be healing. But we still need to remember our charge, the thing that God charges us with is to spread the gospel message around the world. I appreciate your patience. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Pastor Jeff, okay. There's one in the front too.
Let me start with just a little bit of a background. My parents were missionaries in Rwanda back in the early 1970s. We were at Muganero Hospital. And so I grew up there as a kid, made friends, friendships that could have lasted a lifetime. And so many of them are now resting. So that's background of a question that I will have in a moment. But then I praise God that you were there at that time to give encouragement to people that I loved, that I love still. That part of my life doesn't go away. It's always with me. And so I guess the question that I have, having this opportunity to finally hear you in person, is, you've given us one book here, with The Untamed, that I'll have to check out. But is there any other resource that you would give to, someone like me that, I've been able to go back and visit Muganero Hospital, and we have friends that, their whole family survived miraculously, and it's kind of the tearing of sadness and joy,
Right. I from a kind of stand back and try to just understand more of the history than the actual event, and then the repair, kind of three chunks like that. I really appreciate Stephen Kinzer's book. It's called The Rebuilding, Land of a Thousand Hills, The Rebuilding of a Nation, and the Man Who Dreamed It. I appreciate that book especially for the last third about the restorative journey. I learned so much as I read that book. Land of a Thousand Hills, The Rebuilding of a Nation, Stephen Kinzer. Here we go. And again, let me hit images, and that might be a little easier for you to see. Not from a Christian perspective, purely from more of a journalist, although he's an academic as well, but more a journalistic perspective. And I just have been, hungry like anybody else who goes through there to know, how do we cope? How do we heal? How do we live after something like this? So the last third of that book I really appreciated. There's a film called Wounded Healers. That would be another resource. And the last one I'll mention right now, aside from we've reworked our website, and I had a picture of that up on the screen this morning, World Outside My Shoes. And in that we have a section, resources there that we're building and filling in, primarily targeted towards teachers, but we're also keeping in mind faith communities as well as business community. And so World Outside My Shoes, and you'll find that resource page when you just type in worldoutsitemyshoes.org, and you should be able to find some more resources there. But the last one, and I haven't even put these on, so I'm glad you're at, because it's just last week we were putting some finishing touches, and I had a teacher conference, and we were just hurrying to get some things ready for that. But it's also a film called As We Forgive. This one may not be easy to find, but you will find it. It's not like available on Netflix and things at this point right now. But As We Forgive is a very moving account of the repair and the restorative process in Rwanda since then. So that would be another as we forgive the movie. Yeah, you can see it comes out, a 2008 documentary. And it looks like you can watch it, probably pay and watch it on YouTube. That would be, yeah, and one. And I'll be happy. I would love to get your email. And for any of you, too, who have questions, you just didn't feel like today was the time, or you were ready, or even knew how to frame the question, please feel free to shoot me an email anytime. You're not, sometimes I think people might think, well, I don't want to bother him or anything, but carl.wilkens@yahoo.com. Almost worked, didn't it? Yeah, almost worked, didn't it? And so there we go. Carl, didn't mean to delete all of that, and I'd be happy to communicate with you. And carl.wilkens@yahoo.com. There was one, John had his hand up here, Jeff, in the front. And as some of you do, nobody's going to judge anybody who has another appointment or an obligation they need to go to. Please, I hope you feel free. I will, though, just maybe after John, I'll share kind of a concluding gift from Maria and her story.
I know that one thing that the Rwanda government did was to establish some memorials throughout the country. Never again, or let's not forget, with the memorials with whole rooms filled with skulls and bones, and I don't know if you have heard if that's a deterrent. Has that been helpful?
Okay, John, I didn't catch everything, but what I understood was how effective or helpful have the memorials been?
Yeah.
Yeah. The whole spectrum, Some of my Rwandan friends, I'm sure yours too, would tell you the same. We can't bring ourselves to go there. Another friend say it's like my second home. Mm-hmm. The director of the Kigali Genocide Memorial for years, and now he's actually taken on some larger responsibilities. So there's a new director for the memorial, and he's larger up in the organization. Was 18 years old at the time. And his story is a really moving one. I won't be able to tell it all right now, but he will bury his mom and dad, and I think it was his sister, it was a sibling, in the middle of the night, and then flee, and a friend will help him get to Burundi, where he'll survive. Years later, he's running the Kigali Genocide Memorial. He's the lead, the administrator there, and he gets word from his old neighborhood that the people who killed his family want to come to the memorial. I don't know how he finds out, maybe just because he knows their condition and he knows the town. He sends bus money to pay their bus fare to come. Quite confident that some of the guides will take them through when they come. When they come, they don't come saying, we killed the director's family. They come saying, we're from out there near Kibuye area. And it's the actual hometown the other people know of their director. So they're like, oh, Freddie, come here. There's people from your home. They don't know he sent them bus money. They don't know he's the one. And so we figured you would probably want to take them through. And this memorial is such a powerful place in so many ways. But I'm going to just share one place. So Freddie does. He takes them through the memorial, and he gets to this part in the memorial where they have pictures of the children who were killed. And on these little plaques in front of the pictures, you would be able to read their favorite food, their favorite game, things that just little kid things, little details about little kids' lives. And as he's walking through, and of course their name up above there, as he's walking through here, he hears this kind of snort sound behind him. And this is the quietest part of the tour through there. And he doesn't even hardly want to turn around because he's not sure if it was a laugh or if it was a sob. And he turns around and this guy is sobbing in this section of the memorial. And I know if Freddie was to the director, if he was to give you any kind of a comment about the experience for him, it would be about healing. To be in this place, it is so healing when people will confess and they will show remorse. And we sometimes feel fixed to that. It's like if their confession is not with remorse, it's no good. It's the beginning. I've thought about people in prison just rehearsing. What am I going to say when I get to that soccer field? I'm going to tell them how the government authorities, told me to do it. I'm going to tell them how I didn't have a choice. I'm going to tell them. And then you get there and you tell your story. And this little girl, you haven't seen her for years, but you're pretty sure that's your niece. And you hear your story fall on her ears. And you see this other one who was your school teacher. I just keep picking on 3rd or 4th grade teacher. And you hear your story and you realize that story doesn't cut it with your niece and your old school teacher. And it begins to develop cracks for yourself. And you then have a place and an opportunity to really construct a narrative that is more true to what you understand and to what happened. And so these memorial places will give people that place and that opportunity to examine their narrative or to hear the narrative of another person. There's a lot more that's involved there besides the memorializing and respecting. And I mean, one of the best ways we can memorialize is to educate. And not just simply to educate, the facts, but to really begin to have an experiential education, which these memorial sites I think are really conducive, really part of that.
We could spend a whole nother many hours telling our stories.
Did you hear about Adele being on television? That they put her on television and said if everybody forgave her killers like she did, that Rwanda would be a peaceful country. I don't know if you heard that story.
No.
But also, I don't know if you heard that her husband, who had been killed in front of his church members in that Catholic church, 3 years later, they gave him an honorable burial, and he had been thrown into a mass grave, and they unearthed him, and they were amazed that his body was preserved, and they were actually able to shave his face, cut his hair, fingernails, put on a suit, and thousands of people came to his open casket service.
Wow.
Just a total miracle. Another message that his wife had opportunity to give is to forgive your killers.
You're left speechless again and again in those stories. Thank you, John. This is kind of part of the story that I wrestle with telling or not, because the story already seems so sensational. But when Maria's young daughter grew up and got married, they not only invited Filbert to the wedding, but they asked him to be the MC, the host. And I heard that story the same year that our daughter got married, and so a family wedding was very fresh in my mind. And I was still at the point where I was focused on Filbert's, what appeared to me, unrepentant posture. And I hadn't yet gotten to the point of examining my own critical, judgmental posture. So in that framework of a judgmental, critical framework, I hear about this and I'm just like, no. no, no, no. And I say to Maria, and I had talked to the people, about we got to be very cautious and sensitive, and some of our questions, they may be just burning, but now might not be the time. We're just really trying to exercise caution and ask, and respect in asking questions. And I think was breaking my own counsel and trying to rationalize it in my head. Well, they know you were here during the genocide, so you have permission to crazy rationalization. But I just said to Maria, did you have some family who survived? And she said, yeah. And they were able to come to the wedding? Yeah. Weren't some of them upset? Because I'm looking for somebody. Yeah, it feels like me. And she says, yeah. And so I'm like, so why did you do it? And she says, because it was my home. And the more I thought about that, the more I realized Maria is responsible for Maria's healing, not her family. Nobody else is setting the timeline, setting when is right or when is wrong for you to do this. That's Maria's choice and her rights. And in the case with her daughter's wedding, I'm sure a collaborative decision made between her and her daughter. But no sooner had she said that, because it was my home, then she says, but you know what? When my daughter had kids and she asked Filbert to be the godfather of my grandkids, his family was angry with him. And then you can probably pretty much imagine right now what my response was. I don't give a rip about him and his family. Because all I was trying to wrap my mind around was Maria's journey. And then it dawned later in journaling, it dawned on me. And especially as I was putting together some thoughts as I was listening to a sermon from Ty Gibson about space. And we alluded to a bit of this last night. But this idea that this space in a relationship, that if we do not allow each other space, God creating us steps back, gives us dominion, and gives us space. And this whole idea of this sacred space between us, that is the space where relationships can grow or relationships can die. They can be destroyed or they can be reborn. And in this space, I only had Maria, her story. Maria very deftly and beautifully and gracefully stepped out of that center space and put Filbert there. But his family was angry with him. And I'm missing it all in my initial hearing of it, because I'm like, I don't care about him and his family. And it's only later as I look at that and I'm like, I bet that's how she does it. Because I've been looking, trying to figure out, how does she do this? And she has this courageous, beautiful, and from my understanding and perspective, God-given gift of stepping out of the circle yourself with your pain and your own. And I'm not saying everybody should, or I'm not saying that about anybody, because it's not up to me to say it about anybody else. But I'm starting to then say to myself, Carl, when you're angry, when you're frustrated, when you're confused and you're upset, who's in the middle of the circle? And there's times I need to be, because there's a lot to be said about self-care and self-compassion. And I've mentioned to several already here this weekend the work of Kristen Neff and understanding self-compassion, and her research is just really powerful. And so, but once we've also had that, and somehow Maria, I don't know who the neighbors were, I don't know who the support structure was, I don't know all the parts of her story, but she had enough health and then courage and strength to step out of the circle and put Filbert in there. And that's to me, that's Jesus. That's empathy. I pray, Jeff? All right, thanks. Let's pray. Please stand up with me. Father, we are just really, we're just really in awe of what your love, what your plan, your kingdom, the principles of your kingdom We're just really in awe of what can happen when even in small ways we begin to test drive some of these principles. And then we see somebody like Maria in large ways, just taking these concepts, these tools, these strategies, these principles of your kingdom deeper than we ever could imagine. And right now, Lord, you know where I am. I'm kind of at the place where Maria just does not see Filbert as the same person. She sees him as a very different person than the 18-year-old in that gang who killed her husband and sons. And that inspires me, and that gives me hope. And then I stop and I think, well, how do you work most of the time? You work through people. You work through vessels like Maria and Filbert. And I thank you for the journey that you invite us on, and then you walk with us through, and you empower us, and you provide just what we need for every situation. And we know we're never alone. We know it's your love that calms our hearts and that gives us clarity, that helps us move from the downstairs brain to the upstairs brain, that just really can give us hope and peace. And Lord, I think this is of you. And I know it's not of us to put up a timetable, and I know we're not alone, not right here in this church congregation, because I believe in many other, I don't know how many, you know how many other congregations there are. People are looking at a restorative, a transformative approach to rebuilding and repairing relationships and to introducing people to your story, to your kingdom. And so we pray that you'll continue to guide us in these journeys, and we'll be able to make it our own, that as we learn lessons, we can't really cut and paste, but we can definitely bring these to you and then bring our situations and just trust you to work through these experiences together. Thank you, Lord, for the community here, all the years of experience and service that's represented here in this community, and the passion and for service to the community, to be a light on the hill. And we just thank you and continue to celebrate those actions and that light of service here. We love you, and we look forward to crossing paths again here, but especially in your kingdom.